Hello, families. My name is Nathan Scheffler. I'm the Director of Counseling Services here at Pennsylvania Adult and Teen Challenge. Uh, Meeting with you today through video to present to you a presentation on healing from emotional hurt. This is something that I understand a lot of families struggle with, that they deal with. When folks come into treatment, when they're coming into our facility, they're leaving behind in their wake a long trail of broken relationships, hurt feelings, and even physical damages. And that can be a difficult thing to begin to launch into as a family. So we put together this training to provide some understanding of what it is that you may be going through and to provide some practical tips for how to begin to deal with the hurt feelings, the emotional pain that you may be experiencing from having loved somebody in addiction. I myself have worked for the last 10 years in the field of human services, working with people who are hurting. I started off my career working for 5 years at a residential children's home, a home for children who had been taken out of their families for one reason or another. And many of those kids that I worked with, it was due to addiction. And so now I've come around to the other side and I begun to see what that addiction actually is doing to people that's causing them to hurt people that are so close to them. And so the goal of this is to be able to help you to come back to a whole relationship with your person as they're entering into recovery, to allow you to begin to enter into some kind of relational recovery as well as you heal from the emotional hurt that you've experienced. I want to start off this presentation when we're talking about emotional hurt. We want to talk about what are emotions. Everything that we do, everything that our brain does, that it causes our body to do, to behave, is the result of chemical and electrical reactions in our brain. So emotions are primarily chemical, triggered by things around us. They lead us to do things and to feel certain ways. They're built into us, they're designed into human beings for the purpose of survival. Now, you may think that the main purpose for them is relational, but then when we look at relationships, even relationships, the purpose of a relationship is for survival. If you go back to archaic man, who didn't have the benefit of society, he was at the mercy of his environment and at the mercy of predators who were around. But as soon as he developed a relationship with somebody else, found some common ground, and began to work together with them, then he was able to defend himself. Two are stronger than one. A community is stronger than just two people. They were better able to work together to defend themselves. So those emotions are there to help us develop connections with other people. Those emotions also, the emotions of fear, of pleasure, of joy and pain, those are all built into us for the purpose of survival as well. The emotion of sadness tells us that something is missing. Something that was very important to us is missing. The emotion of fear lets us know that there's a threat. There's something that's threatening our survival, our existence, that we need to defend ourselves against. The emotion of pleasure, what addiction plays on, what addiction grabs a hold of in the brain and capitalizes on, is actually a survival emotion built to let us know that there are things built into our existence right now that are going to help us survive. There are things that are beneficial for our survival. So those emotions are there to help us to more quickly respond to situations. When we look at an emotional reaction versus a cognitive response that we think through, emotions allow us to react faster for the purpose of defending ourselves, protecting ourselves, either fighting or running away or freezing up to be able to protect ourselves. And they help us with our connection to other people. We're looking at emotional hurt. This slide is important. It goes back and it looks at the actual definition of that word hurt. We're looking at the definition being an injury or some damage being done. And the reason for this, the reason why I want to talk about this briefly, is because it validates the fact that some actual injury has been made. It's not just, even I talk to my kids sometimes, I'm like, are your feelings just hurt, or are you really physically injured and you need to go to the emergency room? They'll say, well, my feelings are just hurt. But it's not just hurting your feelings. There's actual damage that is done psychologically, emotionally, to a human being when they're hurt, when they're emotionally hurt. This word wound has its root in the German. It means to beat. And I found that interesting because I imagine a lot of you may feel like that through your loved one's addiction, you've been beaten down over and over and over again. Some level of emotional abuse has occurred. Maybe not even purposefully by the individual that was trapped in addiction, but through the addiction that was ravaging their body and their brain, that addiction has beaten you down. And this word injury, root in the French, I always love these legal terms because that's where a lot of our language comes from. It's this idea that it's wrongful, it's unjust, or unlawful, and it's not okay. That's the biggest thing that I want to share with you, is that what's happened to you is not okay. There's no part of this where I want you to get the idea that what's happened to you is all right and it's excusable. It's absolutely not. We may look at it's the addiction and not the person that's done it. It may have been the person that did it, but regardless of where that pain came from, it's not something that's okay. Much of my training, if we look at the next slide, much of my training comes from the field of work in trauma. And trauma is something that we define as a major loss, something that has been cut out of your life, something that was there that you become used to, your brain is wrapped around and understood that's always going to be there, is now gone. There's a few key parts to this. It's something that's the worst possible thing that you could imagine happening to you. Worse than anything that your imagination could put together. And you can't make it stop. Now think about that for a moment. And think about the addiction that you may have experienced. It's something that's worse than you ever expected when you were thinking about your future with your child or your spouse, or their future. It's worse than you ever could have imagined. The things that happen to you from somebody that you're supposed to trust and care, they're supposed to care for you and love you. It's worse than you could have possibly imagined. And you try as hard as you might, you were unable to make it stop. You were unable to physically control it. Trauma retrains the brain. So our brains are adaptable. And just like we watch in addiction, a person goes through this process of first experimenting, and then maybe risky use, and then regular use, and then full-blown addiction. We also see this process with trauma, where when it starts out, we say, wow, that was pretty terrible. I hope that never happens again. And our brain kind of accepts it as an exception. But then as it continues to happen, the brain starts to realize, well, this might be something that's going to happen again. We need to begin to defend against it. And it starts to adjust their thinking, adjust their thought patterns. In late stage trauma, long-term protracted trauma, and late-stage addiction, we see the exact same thing happen to the brain, where the cognitive rational thinking part of the brain actually shuts down, and we're operating purely on emotion. And some of you folks may have actually gotten to that point where you see yourselves only operating emotionally. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But the important thing to remember here is that it does retrain the brain. Not everyone has experienced major, prolonged, persistent, repeated traumatic events. And not everybody has experienced this terrible big T long-term trauma, but we all have experienced some level of trauma in our life. We know what loss is. We know what it's like to lose something, to have something taken away from us. We call those little T traumas, and the same principles still apply. When something is lost, when something's missing, we need to be able to work through that, to be able to accept it and move on from it. And if we don't, then it can actually cause greater damage to us emotionally and mentally. The effects of trauma on an individual, I already started getting into this just a little bit, but just want to let you know that there's a broad spectrum of things that happen for somebody who's experienced an emotional wound, mental or emotional abuse, or has been experienced this level of trauma. Emotionally, we begin to feel different about things. Maybe you overreact or underreact. You may feel more emotion in simple situations than you typically do, or something terrible happens and you say, well, I'm kind of used to terrible things happening at this point. That's really no big deal. You overreact or underreact. Start to blow up over little things. You may experience emotional numbness where you just don't feel anything at all. They talk about this idea that the world is gray, this Eeyore sensation. We see that in addiction. When people are in late stage addiction, they're just experiencing this mundane, everything's just going to be the same thing every day. Nothing's really ever going to change or get better. And there's a numbness that goes along with it. And we stop reacting to things that we should react to. Behaviorally, we begin to act differently, and really all this is the brain beginning to protect itself. It's finding a way to protect itself. We act differently so because the brain causes the body to change the way that it acts to be more defensive, protect ourselves. Mentally, as I said, it changes the way that the brain works. We stop using the ability to think through things and begin reacting emotionally, because those emotional reactions protect us faster than thinking through what we know about a situation. We begin to develop maladaptive coping skills. Coping skills are something we all do. We all cope with stress. Sometimes we cope with stress in a healthy way. Sometimes we cope with stress in an unhealthy way, such as using drugs or alcohol. But sometimes even those healthy coping skills can turn into unhealthy coping mechanisms. Something like taking a nap makes me feel better. So when I'm stressed out, I may go take a nap. Now that's a healthy adaptive coping skill, because I know that that's something that causes me to relieve stress, to reduce stress. But in the middle of a work day, when I've had a bad meeting with my boss and I go back to my office, it would probably not be the right time to sit down and take a nap. But I know that this is something that helps me, so I lay down, I take a nap in the middle of the work day for a couple of hours. My boss finds me. It's now something that's impacted my life in a negative way. That's what we see with maladaptive coping skills. We use them to an extent, or we use them in the wrong situations to the point where they become unhealthy for us. We may refuse to accept reality. We begin to live in a world where, hey, we wish that this didn't happen. You know what? Let's just pretend like it didn't happen. So we'll move along and pretend like this situation hasn't happened. We refuse to accept reality, which is incredibly dangerous, because we're avoiding all of these potential threats that go along with what's actually happening in our life. And we may experience repressed or suppressed emotions and memories. Repressed emotions are things that we choose to not feel about. Think of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. She says, well, I'll just think about that tomorrow. Suppressed emotions is our brain trying to protect us, choosing to not allow us to feel certain things, which is also dangerous, because now we're walking through life unable to experience reality, unable to feel what's really in front of us, what's really going on. This can create anxiety. I think of it as these feelings move to the back of the head when we don't deal with them. They move to the back of our brain and start throwing these little rocks of anxiety at us and picking on us and saying, hey, why don't you think about this? Creates a lot of anxiety. So this is what recovery from emotional harm, from trauma, from addiction looks like, is the brain changes, so we need to begin to work to change it back. And it takes a lot more work, it seems like, to change it back than it does to change it initially. These brain changes, it takes some digging in, some spending time, and actual purposeful work to be able to make happen. I share this a lot, and I've always gotten confirmation back from folks when I say that your loved one has experienced an addiction. They've experienced this disease. They become so laser focused on a substance, where they spend all their time acquiring it, chasing after it, thinking about it, to the detriment of their families, to the detriment of their work, to the detriment of everything around them. And families, a lot of the time, have experienced an addiction of their own. Their addiction hasn't been to a substance, but their addiction has been to their loved one who's in an addiction. You begin to spend all of your time thinking about the person, all of your time focusing on them, trying to get them to change, to the detriment of the things around you. Maybe some of you have experienced where there's been a loss of performance at work, loss of relationships, loss of significant amounts of money poured into this individual trying to get them help. And now, as your loved one begins recovery, the recovery from their chemical addiction, I encourage families to begin a recovery of your own. Understand this is going to be a slow process. This is going to be something you have to put some work into, but you really do need to prioritize your own recovery from the emotional hurt that you've experienced, from the addiction that you've had to this individual. Maybe depending on the length of time and the amount of energy that you've invested into that person, it may be similar to a late-stage addiction or a long-term protracted trauma that may take some time, some counseling and some help to be able to come back from. We recommend for your loved ones that 30 days isn't enough, and we say the same thing to you. That 30 days is not going to be enough time. A year isn't going to be enough time to be able to completely heal from this, but it can do an awful lot of good if you're purposefully spending time focusing on recovering from that. This quote at the bottom, think small, aim low, go slow. When we're looking for progress in this situation, we're looking for take it easy, take it slow. The biggest thing is to be nice to yourself. on the next slide after this one. So what do we do? How do we begin to heal from the wounds that we have? I'm going to provide some practical responses, some general clinical recommendations to help yourself to begin to change something in your own life, to take some initiative and spend some time on being able to help yourself and engage the help of others if necessary. First step, you got to be kind. This is my number one rule. Actually, my only rule for counseling. In the 3 years that I've been a counselor here at Teen Challenge, the only rule that I've had as I step into groups, as I step into individual sessions, I share this with all my patients right out of the gate. I say, listen, the number one rule is that you're kind. That's the only thing I'm going to hold you accountable to here, starting off. You need to be kind. You need to be kind to other people, of course. And that's important in a group setting, that we make sure that we're not picking on other people. But more importantly, and sometimes harder than that, is the ability to be kind to yourself. You need to be kind to yourself. You need to cut yourself a break. Recognize the impact that this has had. If you think back through the last couple of slides, we've said that you may have potentially experienced the same thing of long-term protracted abuse. You've experienced potentially this significant trauma in your life where your brain has changed, your way of thinking has been altered, and you're now starting to live in a completely different way. If you think about the gravity of that, you can't expect to come back from that in just a couple of days or just doing a few quick things. This is something that may take some time. It's the same thing that we share with people in addiction is, listen, addiction makes you want to do everything right away. It makes you want to get it done. Like, I wish that I had this all taken care of 2 days ago. But we need to slow down a little bit. We need to be nice to ourselves, recognize that this is going to take some time. It's going to take some process. Recognize the significance of what you're attempting to do. Look for the little changes, and man, just celebrate them. And when you get a little change, when you notice that you're not spending all of your time worrying about this individual anymore, when it comes to little things that you notice that are starting to change in your life, celebrate that and enjoy it. And again, think small, aim low, and go slow. We're looking for reduction in symptomology. So the negative things that you've begun to experience in your life, we want to see a reduction in that, and maybe an increase in some of the more positive things that you're going for. I want to talk for a minute about self-talk, and this is a great clinical recommendation that we use because the way that we focus our attention changes the circuitry of the brain. The way that we focus attention changes the circuitry of the brain. When we focus on math, okay, maybe you haven't thought about math since you were in Algebra 2 in high school, but for somebody who's a mathematician and they've spent an awful lot of time focusing on that, the parts of the brain that think about math are going to be really well developed. Our brain adapts, it adjusts, it changes. We call that neuroplasticity. It's the plastic nature of the brain. The fact that it changes and it makes decisions, the brain on its own develops parts that we use and allows parts that we don't use to not be so developed, to deteriorate a little bit. The purpose of that is so that we can be really good at the stuff that we need to be really good at, and the stuff that we don't need to spend time on. If I don't use that part of my brain, the brain says we're not going to spend energy and waste energy on that. So if you spend all of your time thinking about being stuck in a spot, being devalued, maybe you've been told and your brain has really well developed under the assumption that you're not worth anything, then you're going to start to believe it and you're going to start to operate as if you're not worth anything. But we can change that tape. We can change the tape. We can change the record, switch it out for a different one, and we get to make the decision what we tell ourselves and what we start to think about. The book, I think it's called Healing from Emotional Hurt. I'll leave the reference up at the end of this training. It's the last slide on this show. It talks about Satan's greatest weapon against us is low self-esteem, because if you have low self-esteem and you believe that you can't do anything, then guess what? You're not going to do anything. We can change that tape and we can begin to talk to ourselves, reminding ourselves that we have value, that we can accomplish things, that we're worth something. So practice it with me. Take a deep breath in through the nose. Let it out through the mouth. And say to yourself, I have value. Remind yourself of that. Remind yourself that you're worth putting in the time and the effort to do this. That you're worth more than what you've been told. That when somebody's wounded you emotionally, that should not have happened. Okay? that you can accomplish things, that the things that you're setting out to start working on, this journey of recovery that you're setting out on as a family member, that it's something that can be done. All right. There's a lot to be said for the can-do attitude, for reminding ourselves that we can do something. One of the worst effects of pain inflicted by someone else is the loss of value to ourselves. So we need to come back to that and keep reminding ourselves that we have value, that we can accomplish things, that this isn't going to last forever. And we do that by telling it to ourselves, sometimes out loud, sometimes reciting it to ourselves. I encourage you to find a few statements that you use to encourage yourself and write them on a card that you carry with you and you read periodically throughout the day. Evidence-backed therapy, evidence-based therapy has proven that that's effective in changing the way that people's brain circuitry actually fires and strengthens brain circuitry in different parts of the brain just by changing the way that we talk to ourselves. Something that we want to do on this next slide, we want to start to learn to recognize emotions. A lot of the time, most of society goes through the day and we don't even think about the feelings that we're having. This is a skill in itself that needs to be practiced. It's something that's not going to come all at once, but as we go through our day, begin to name your emotions, even if it's just quietly to yourself. Identify them and name them. Try to get away from just saying, I feel good or I feel bad. Okay, there's a lot that goes along with feeling good, or a lot that goes along with what we assume to be feeling bad. We begin to name those emotions. I feel happy, I feel excited, I feel meh, I feel okay, I feel mellow. Or maybe I feel angry, frustrated, sad, disgusted. All right, start to name those emotions. Ask yourself this question: How do I feel? How am I feeling right now? And when you name it, it does something where it brings it to the front of your consciousness, where you can begin to deal with it. When it's not named, it's something that you can't even start to work with because you don't even know that it's there. So really the biggest thing with this is beginning to bring things to the front of our consciousness, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. One last thing that I want to mention here before I get into a few more suggestions is developing a sense of community. Now listen, I talked about the connection between trauma and addiction, that they both do similar things to the brain. So we can talk about recovery from both in a very similar way. The number one indicator for whether somebody, we do a relapse potential assessment, assessing somebody's potential to relapse, which can be used also as a potential for recovery. The number one indicator for relapse is a lack of community. And the number one indicator for recovery is having a strong community. The quality and quantity of a person's community determines how successful they're going, is one of the key determining factors in how successful they're going to be in their recovery. If you have a lot of people around you, they're positive people working towards the same goals that you're working towards, then you have a lot more support and a lot greater likelihood that you're going to be successful in your recovery. If you have a lot of people around you, but they're negative influences, or you don't have very many people around you at all, then we can begin to assume that you're at a higher risk for relapse and in more trouble. So when we're starting to work towards healing from trauma, healing from emotional hurt, we need to start looking at developing some community around us. Not to mention the fact that a lot of this community in addiction and in emotional pain has been lost because we've been spending so much time focused on the object of what we've been focusing on. So we need to begin to develop that community again. There's strength in numbers. There is a tremendous benefit to talking about it. And it took me a few years of counseling to begin to figure this out. I didn't learn this in my master's degree. I had to learn this afterwards. That the left brain and the right brain, we have our right brain is more ethereal, it's more pictures, it's just kind of floating out there. It doesn't really have any structure to it. Well, the left brain is linear. Everything's written, it works in words, it works in lists, it works in logic. And so anxiety, for example, lives in the right brain, where it's something that could potentially happen, but there's no actual clear direct threat. Talking takes the things that are kind of floating around in this picture-oriented right brain and begins to put words to them and lining them up and organizing thoughts. And we can begin to connect the left and right brain and begin to use both of them equally through talk therapy. That's something that talk therapy does. That's something that writing does. Huge advocate for being able to journal about what we do or what we're feeling, what we're thinking about, because it takes things out of the right brain and puts them down in a left brain logical listed order. So talking about it is important, and you do that through community, through support groups, things like Al-Anon, through these family days here. As you get the chance to interact with other families, realize that you're not alone, that you're not the only person who's dealing with this. That's something else that community can do for us, is tell us that, hey, we're not just some crazy wacko who's the only person in the entire world that's ever experienced this. There's a lot of other people around who have experienced the same thing. Provides emotional support as well as actual physical support. If we need something, if we need a ride somewhere, a lot of the time, if we have a community, there might be somebody that can provide us with that physical support. So seek out that community and see if you can find some support through that. Talking about emotions, some things that we recommend is digging into mindfulness. Mindfulness is something that we teach as part of our dialectical behavior therapy model. We're providing psychoeducation groups throughout the week. Every day there's a psychoeducation group focused on some aspect of dialectical behavior therapy, and one full quarter of that is built around mindfulness. Mindfulness practically is just awareness. It's just noticing things in us and around us. And it starts with a self-awareness, this idea that we can become more aware of ourselves. Again, by naming your emotions. We just talked about naming your emotions. By thinking about what we're thinking about. So many people don't do that. They go through life and they never think about what they're thinking about. Being able to slow down a little bit, begin to notice. And again, I'm not going to be able to get into a long discussion about what mindfulness is, but I encourage you to research it, spend some time looking at it. And there's an awful lot out there about mindfulness right now. I think Time Magazine just did an issue on mindfulness, but there's a lot of good resources. Again, at the end of this slide presentation, there's a few books that I highly recommend that are on there, and they focus on that. Self-awareness, and then beginning to become aware of your instincts. Remember I said that emotional instincts become paramount in late-stage addiction, in late-stage trauma, and we begin to emotionally react to the things that are around us, and it'll get to a point where we don't even notice that we're doing it anymore. The idea here is to begin to slow down, to begin to notice, okay, wait, why did I just do that? What was it that just made me act that way? And try to identify, trace it back, and find out what instinct is triggered by what emotion and where that emotion came from, and then to begin to restructure that. It's a lot of what we do in therapy. It's a lot of what we do through mindful approaches to self-awareness. Awareness of instincts, both adaptive and maladaptive instincts. We talked about adaptive coping skills, maladaptive coping skills. It's the same type of thing with instincts, is we have things that help us, instincts that help us. If I'm being chased by a bear, I'm going to turn around and run away instinctually. But then those running instincts can become maladaptive, where now I'm running away from relationships that I should be spending time developing. Mindfulness is the opposite of automatic responses. And then this stretches out into others' awareness, mindfulness of our relationships, thinking about how we interact with other people, and awareness of the environment. I always talk about, when I'm talking about mindfulness, suggest that mindfulness in any area increases mindfulness in every area. Mindfulness in any area increases mindfulness in every area. So if we start walking out of the room where you're sitting today, start to look around and notice things that maybe you haven't noticed before. Just walk a little bit slower, look around, and pay attention to things that maybe you've had your head down, trucking along, not really having time to slow down and notice things before. So awareness of the environment is a piece of this. I'm going to make a brief statement about anxiety and depression. These are some of the things that more people in the United States struggle with than anything else, it seems like. Anxiety is worry about something in the future that may or may not, likely won't, be as bad as we expect it to be. And anxiety builds up and gets worse and worse and worse. It's a focus. It's a preoccupied focus on the future. Depression is the opposite of that. Sadness over something that's happened in the past and preoccupies us as though it's, even though it's not currently happening. We spend all of our time thinking about these things that have happened in the past. A key part of mindfulness, just to go back to that last slide, is to spend time focused right here on this moment in time and this place in the present. And anxiety gets us away from that because it starts to drag us into the future where we aren't even living and we don't even know what's going to happen. But we start to think about it, we start to plan for it, and then we start to worry about it, and then it becomes everything that we always think about. And now we're no longer spending time here in the present. We're spending time in the future that isn't even happening. We spend time in depression. We get dragged back into the things that have happened, the sad things that have happened in the past, and we lose our focus on what's currently happening. So mindfulness, focusing on what's happening right here and right now, can give us some level of relief in the symptoms that we experience from spending time in anxiety and depression. Something you can do when you're experiencing anxiety and depression, there's different levels of this. There is clinical anxiety and clinical depression, and those are things that you do need professional help for. I don't recommend that you try to treat dangerous levels of anxiety and depression on your own just through self-talk and mindfulness. But for what most folks experience, the level of anxiety and depression that I think almost everybody experiences, one or the other, a lot of the time you can begin to work on this yourself or begin to reach out to other people and have some support. Again, through those support groups, through that community, begin to develop some growth from these two issues. Stress. Stress is something that's designed into us to be able to motivate action. But then when we can't do anything about it, then it just sits and festers and grows and seems to get worse and worse. Again, an awareness, mindfulness of those stress triggers is something that can help us out. When we begin to notice that it's starting, then we can begin to put things in place to be able to deal with it. When we're thinking about stress, the first question that I ask this in a lot of different scenarios. I ask this in interviews when I'm interviewing folks to come on board with us for staff, because I want to know that people have an awareness of what causes them to feel stress. I do this when I'm working with a patient in counseling. I say, what is it that makes you feel stressed? Let's spend some time talking about that and specifically identifying the things that cause you to feel stress. What do you feel in your body that lets you know that you're feeling stressed? Is it tension in your shoulders? Is it a knot in your gut? Is it shallow breathing? Do you start to get headaches? What is it that lets you know that you're feeling stressed? Because a lot of the time we get to the end of the day and we say, boy, that was a stressful day, but we don't really know anything specific that caused it to be stressful. Maybe your stress response is triggered by something. We spent time looking at that. Again, I recommend taking things out of that right brain, out of that ethereal floating right brain, and writing them down in a logical fashion. Being able to identify specific things on a piece of paper that cause us to feel stressed. Maybe writing on this paper is going to cause you some extra stress, and so put that down on the paper. Put everything down on your list that causes you to feel some level of stress. And then you can begin to identify those things and begin to plan for how to treat them in your own life. Our brain is a con man on some level, and it tricks us. It tricks us into stressing about things that we don't need to. It tricks us into having anxiety and worry about things that we don't necessarily need to. And we just let it go to town. We just give it full rein and say, you do what you need to do. And we don't spend any time actually intervening and helping ourselves out. Seeing what's written down can help us to actually logically address each one of those things and say, well, now, really, that doesn't seem like that's that bad. Or maybe this is something that's a major thing in my life that I need to spend some time on. But it doesn't just float them all into the same level. Logically organizes our thoughts and draws things out of that right brain. Now that we have a knowledge of stress, now that we understand what things stress us out, what do we do with it? We begin to develop coping skills. I talked earlier about we have adaptive coping skills and maladaptive coping skills, but we're going to talk more about developing healthy coping skills to be able to deal with stress. A large part of trauma therapy is built around coping skills, being able to find ways to make ourselves safe when our brain is pushing us to be unsafe. Coping skills are things that we do to help relieve the symptoms of stress. And so this, when I meet with people who say, well, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to cope, I don't have any idea where to start, I say, okay, well, here's a good starting point. What do you enjoy doing? Well, I don't really enjoy doing anything. I haven't done anything in a long time. Okay, so go back to when you remember being able to enjoy doing things. What are some things that you used to enjoy doing? What are some things that you spent time recreationally doing in the past? What when do you remember feeling happy and relaxed? Was it when you were on the beach? Was it when you were hiking in the woods? Was it when you were around your family? What was it that caused you to feel happy and relaxed? And that's a really good starting point and a good spot to start our list. So some suggestions: walking, going for a walk. There's some part of the swaying back and forth movement that actually helps with that connection to the left brain and right brain. There's an eye movement desensitization, EMDR. I don't remember what the R is for. EMDR is a therapy that's used to connect the parts of the brain, and it's a trauma therapy. There's a connection. There's been an evidence-based connection between things like walking or cross-country skiing and EMDR as it moves back and forth and connects those two sides of the brain. So walking is a good activity. Physical activity, remember, stress motivates us towards action, and a lot of the time all we do is we sit and we don't have the ability to actually burn it off, so our body is building up a head of steam while we've got the brakes on. Being able to do some kind of physical activity can provide a physical response that our body is looking for. Going for a run, working out, working on something. Growing up in a farming community, I know how important work is to a lot of the folks in that community, being able to actually do something with the stress that they're feeling. Utilize community. Develop the people around you. I'm talking about dialectical behavior therapy. That's actually our second module, is interpersonal effectiveness, how to work together with other people and how to develop that level of community. Things like crafts, sewing, woodworking, cooking, all of those are physical activities that can take our mind off of what's going on around us, but they can also provide us with a physical outlet for emotional stress. And then meditation. Digging into some level of meditation. There's a reference at the end of the presentation for John Kabat-Zinn, The Full Catastrophe Living. You can dig into all kinds of different resources on the internet for meditation. But meditation is really taking that level of mindfulness and deciding what I'm going to think about and taking it a little bit farther. Saying, you know what, I'm going to choose to think about happy, uplifting things. I'm going to meditate on those things. There's a form of meditation that's just allowing your thoughts to pass through your mind. Recognizing them coming, developing a practice of allowing the thoughts to come and go, identifying them, understanding them, and then allowing them to pass, which can help us regain control of our brain, which we've lost control of a lot of the time through addiction or through trauma or through emotional pain. We've lost control of portions of our brain. These are things that can help us to practice and develop and retrain our brains. I want to talk about unsuppressing emotions and memories. One of the defense mechanisms of our brain is to hide or suppress really heavy emotions because those emotions are too heavy at the time for us to maintain our sanity and still experience. So the brain just makes the decision to not think about them. This is too much. I'm going to stash this away for a little bit. It's still there. That's the biggest problem with it, is that it's still there. I recommend that you have the courage to talk about things that have happened to you, to begin to process them, the hurts that you've experienced, the pain that you've experienced. And if needed, seek out professional counseling. This is something where, for some of these really deep, impacted issues, you do need the help of somebody else. Regardless of how you choose to do this, go slow, be kind to yourself. If you do this too quickly, it can actually be more damaging mentally and emotionally. Recommend practicing loss rituals. When we experience a loss, when we experience something that's missing from our life, when we experience a trauma, we need to be able to process it. Recognizing more and more in my professional and personal life the importance of accepting and acknowledging and then moving on past major losses. We can begin practicing these things with even smaller losses when you lose anything. When something passes from your life that you really enjoyed, that you liked, and now it's no longer a part of it, that's a loss. That's something that's missing. Process it. Think about it. Go through the grief process. And these loss rituals are things that we do. Now, different cultures do different things. You think about the loss of a person who is important to you. Some cultures create shrines. We, in America, we have cemeteries with headstones. We go and visit the person or the headstone. we do things to process the losses, to acknowledge them, to acknowledge that this has been lost. One of the more dangerous things that you can do is pretend like it didn't happen. And then we're living in a world of unacceptance. We're not living in a world of what is. We're living in a world of what we wish it was. And then we've got grief process. I'm just going to leave this slide up here for a brief moment. But the thing that I want to say about this is that your body and your brain are built to go through this process. Not everybody goes through it linearly. Not everybody goes through it in a line, starting with one thing and then the next and the next and the next. Sometimes we bounce all over. Sometimes we feel all 5 of them in one day, right? But understand that our brain is made to work through this loss process. These different emotions that we feel as part of the loss, that's helping us to develop an understanding of what's happened, helping us to move into a new life without what it is that we've lost. So if you're thinking about the loss of what future you imagined for your child, right? Now they've had this addiction and they can no longer experience the future that you're hoping that they would. The loss process allows us to grieve that and then begin to look at what this is going to look like currently, what really is going to be realistic, and move into that. And acceptance is the end goal of the grief process. It's the end goal of trauma therapy. It's the end goal of a lot of this. Acceptance, the end result of the grief process, we need to make a decision that we're going to accept reality as it is in all of its good and bad, light and dark. We need to accept what it is. So it allows us to live in a world of what is, not a world of what should be. I talk about driving down the highway and you see a sign that says there's an accident ahead, be prepared to stop. But you don't want to believe that the world could be such a terrible place where people could get into accidents and there could be mangled vehicles and bodies and pain. And so you say, you know what, I'm going to pretend like that doesn't exist. I'm going to pretend like this kind of world doesn't exist. So you leave your foot on the accelerator, keep going 65 miles an hour, pretending like there's no accident, pretending like there's no stop traffic, and the results are catastrophic. We do the same thing. We're more harmful to ourselves and damaging to ourselves when we choose not to accept reality as it is. This last slide is a quote from William Shakespeare, and I understand that the context is off here. He's talking about death, but I love the quote excluded from its context just by itself. He talks about this undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. This idea that no traveler returns, that nobody comes back from any experience being the same person that they were before. We're always trying to find that same person. We're always trying to get back to who we were before. I want to be who I was when I was in my 20s and I was feeling great all the time and I was a happy person and I was unattached and able to, but that life doesn't exist anymore, and we come back and we're a changed person from whatever experience we've seen. This idea that you don't ever come back to the same town, even though the town may be the same, when you leave you come back with new experiences and that changes the way that you see things. For me, it's a lesson in acceptance, being able to recognize that, hey, listen, I'm going to accept that I'm not the same person that I was before. Before whatever life experiences I've experienced, I'm not the same person anymore. I need to look around and identify what this new world is that I'm living in and then be able to live in that. This last slide, I just want to leave you with some resources. I talked about a lot of the content came from this website, The 10 Ways to Develop Emotional Intelligence in Recovery. Mindfulness and Meditation by John Kabat-Zinn. He has a couple of different resources, a couple of different books, but this is one that I found really helpful specifically for mindfulness. Marsha Linehan is the lady who developed dialectical behavior therapy that we're using, and so her book is on there for reference. And then this Healing from Damaged Emotions is a book where I drew some of the concepts for this training. Thank you so much. I hope that this helps in some way. Reach out to us. Reach out to if your loved one has a pastoral mentor in our long-term program, a counselor in our short-term program, or a family department. Reach out to these folks. Let us know how this training has helped. If there's anything in here that should be different. But we hope to be able to work together through our family programs to be able to benefit the individual, of course, the individual that's recovering from addiction, but also the families on the other hand. We want to be able to support you guys and help you as you're working through this process. We recognize it's a big thing. It's a big thing that you're working on. But take your time. Be nice to yourself. And take it easy on this one. Thank you guys so much for participating and watching this. We hope the best for you.